I stared at the crumpled, dirt-stained $5 bill resting in my frozen palm. It was the very last of my mother's money, and the only thing standing between my 6-year-old sister, Colleen, and freezing to death on the brutal, unforgiving streets of Oakhaven. When the county auctioneer slammed his heavy wooden gavel and declared me the new owner of a condemned, rusted-out shack on the toxic edge of town, the wealthy investors in the room laughed. They whispered that I had just bought a metal coffin for the two of us. They didn't know about the historic blizzard that was rapidly approaching, and they certainly didn't know about the terrifying, miraculous secret buried deep beneath those rotting floorboards, a secret that would fundamentally rewrite our destinies. The day I turned 18 didn't come with a cake, balloons, or singing. It came with the deafening sound of a deadbolt unlocking and the heavy thud of my Uncle Arthur's steel-toed boots against the front door. "Time's up, Liam," Arthur's voice boomed through the thin walls of the cramped apartment. It was a voice that always sounded like gravel grinding against glass. I was sitting on the edge of a worn mattress, holding my breath, tightly clutching Colleen to my chest. She was asleep, her small face buried in the collar of my worn denim jacket. It had been exactly 8 months since the car accident that took our parents. 8 months since Uncle Arthur, my father's estranged, deeply indebted older brother, swooped in with a squad of expensive lawyers, claiming legal guardianship and liquidating every asset my parents had spent their lives building. He had found a loophole in their hastily written will, seized the family hardware store, and drained the bank accounts. He was supposed to take care of us. Instead, he dumped us in this squalid, unheated apartment on the wrong side of Oakhaven, Oregon, waiting for the exact second I became a legal adult so he could sever all ties. I said, "Time is up," Arthur yelled again, kicking the door so hard the frame splintered. He stepped inside, shaking the freezing November rain from his expensive trench coat. He looked around the barren room with an expression of profound disgust. "You're a man now, Liam. Congratulations. The state says you're on your own, and my obligations are officially terminated. I want you and the brat out of my property in 10 minutes. Arthur, please," I begged, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't wake Colleen. "It's 30 degrees outside. The forecast says a blizzard is rolling in tonight. Just give us the weekend. Let me find a job at the mill." "Not my problem," Arthur sneered, pulling a silver pocket watch from his vest. "I have a new tenant moving in tomorrow who's actually going to pay rent. You have exactly 9 minutes left." Desperation clawed at my throat. I had applied everywhere for work, but Oakhaven was a dying logging town, and nobody was hiring a scrawny 18-year-old high school dropout. I gently shook Colleen awake. Her large, frightened blue eyes blinked up at me. "Come on, bug," I whispered, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "We're going on an adventure." We packed everything we owned into a single frayed canvas duffel bag. 2 changes of clothes for Colleen, a worn fleece blanket, a flashlight with dying batteries, and a framed photograph of our parents. Before we walked out, I checked my pockets. I had my ID, a pocket knife my dad gave me, and exactly one $5 bill. The moment we stepped onto the sidewalk, the biting Oregon wind cut right through my thin jacket. Colleen shivered violently, her small fingers gripping my hand like a vice. "Where are we going, Liam?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To find a castle," I lied, swallowing the massive lump of terror in my throat. For 4 hours, we walked the freezing streets. The Salvation Army shelter was overflowing, a line of desperate people wrapping around the block. When I approached the front desk, the exhausted volunteer just shook her head. "We're over capacity, son. The fire marshal won't let us take a single soul more. Try the church over on 4th Street. But the church was locked. As the afternoon sky darkened to a bruised purple, panic truly began to set in. My breath plumed in the freezing air. Colleen's lips were taking on a terrifying shade of blue. To make matters worse, as we sat on a bench near the town square, I saw the familiar powder blue sedan of Mrs. Higgins, the local Child Protective Services caseworker. She had been circling us like a hawk for months, just waiting for a reason to throw Colleen into the foster system and separate us forever. If she saw us sleeping on a park bench, it was over. We sought refuge in the vestibule of the county courthouse, the only public building still open. The heat, radiating from the radiators, felt like a warm embrace. We huddled in the corner, trying to make ourselves invisible. That was when I saw it. Pinned to a corkboard near the restrooms was a bright yellow flyer, Oakhaven County Delinquent Property Auction. Today, 4 p.m., courtroom B. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3:55 p.m. I didn't know anything about real estate, but I knew that at tax auctions, properties sometimes went for literal pennies if the back taxes were cleared, or if the county was just desperate to unload condemned liabilities. "Stay right here by the radiator, Colleen. Don't move," I instructed, handing her the fleece blanket. "I'll be right back." I pushed through the heavy oak doors into courtroom B. It was packed with local businessmen, contractors, and landlords, including, to my absolute horror, Uncle Arthur, who was sitting in the second row, laughing with the mayor. I slunk into the very back row, trying to melt into the wooden pew. At the front, an exhausted-looking auctioneer was running through a list of properties. Most were foreclosed homes going for tens of thousands of dollars. Bidding wars erupted over prime real estate. I sat there, my heart sinking. I had $5. What was I thinking? This was a place for men with checkbooks, not homeless teenagers with lint in their pockets. I was about to leave when the auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, moving on to the final lot of the day. Parcel number 889, located at the very end of Briarwood Lane." Now, before we start, full disclosure, this property was condemned by the city 3 years ago. It's a rusted-out, corrugated metal structure sitting on a quarter-acre of brownfield land. No plumbing, no electricity. The county just wants it off the ledger. Opening bid is a nominal fee of $5 to cover the filing paperwork. Do I hear $5? Silence fell over the courtroom. A few men chuckled. Uncle Arthur leaned back, picking his teeth with a toothpick. "You'd have to pay me $1,000 to take that tetanus trap," someone muttered, drawing a round of laughter. "Going once for $5? The auctioneer droned, looking utterly bored. "Going twice. If we stayed in the courthouse, the guards would kick us out at 5 p.m. If we went into the streets, Colleen would freeze. If Mrs. Higgins found us, I would lose my sister forever. Condemned or not, it was 4 walls and a roof. It was an address. It was legal shelter." My hand shot up into the air. The entire courtroom turned to look at me. The laughter died in an instant. Uncle Arthur's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into a glare of absolute venom. "Ah," the auctioneer said, raising his glasses. "We have a bid of $5 in the back. Do I hear 10? $10 for the Briarwood parcel?" Crickets. Nobody was crazy enough to bid on a toxic, rusting shed. "Sold. For $5. To the young man in the back. Come see the clerk to process your deed." My legs felt like jelly as I walked down the center aisle. I could feel Arthur's furious gaze burning a hole in the back of my head. I approached the clerk's desk, pulled the crumpled, dirt-stained $5 bill from my pocket, and smoothed it out on the mahogany wood. The old clerk, a man named Silas, with kind, crinkled eyes, took the bill. He looked at me, then at the bill, and sighed softly. "You know there's nothing out there but rust, rats, and bad memories, right, son?" "It's a home," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "It has to be." Silas stamped a heavy stack of papers and handed me a thick, manila envelope and a rusted brass key. "May God watch over you out there, boy. You're going to need it." The walk to Briarwood Lane took an hour, and with every step, the town of Oakhaven grew bleaker and more desolate. We crossed the train tracks, leaving behind the paved roads and streetlights, entering a forgotten industrial sector that had died 2 decades ago. The freezing rain had turned into a fine, stinging sleet. "My feet hurt, Liam," Colleen whimpered, her teeth chattering so hard I could hear them. "I know, Bug. We're almost there. Just a little further," I urged, practically carrying her under one arm while lugging the duffel bag with the other. Finally, we reached the end of a cracked, weed-choked asphalt road. Sitting alone in the center of a barren, frozen dirt lot was our new home. It was worse than the auctioneer had described. It wasn't a house. It was an old industrial utility shed, roughly the size of a one-car garage. The exterior was entirely made of corrugated tin panels that had oxidized into a bleeding, dark, orange rust. Half the roof was sagging dangerously. The two small windows were shattered, completely open to the elements. The front door was a heavy slab of dented metal, covered in faded, peeling yellow paint. I fumbled with the rusted brass key, my fingers numb and clumsy. The lock screeched in protest, but it finally gave way. I pushed the heavy door open. It ground against the concrete foundation with a terrible, groaning scrape. We stepped inside, and I immediately tasted dust, decay, and old motor oil. The interior was a single, cavernous room. The floor was made of wide, uneven, wooden planks, many of them warped and rotting from water damage. In the corner sat a pile of garbage old tires, broken glass, and rusted car parts. The wind howled right through the broken windows, making the tin walls rattle and hum like a giant, off-key tuning fork. It was barely warmer inside than it was outside. Tears welled up in my eyes. I had spent my last $5 on a death trap. "Is this the castle?" Colleen asked, looking up at me. Her voice wasn't sarcastic. It was genuinely hopeful. She trusted me completely, and that trust broke my heart into a million pieces. "Yeah," I forced myself to say, blinking back the tears. "It's a fixer-upper, but it's ours. Nobody can kick us out of here, Colleen. Never again." Survival instinct kicked in. We didn't have time to be depressed. The temperature was plummeting fast. I dropped the duffel bag and immediately went to work. I dragged the old tires and a massive piece of discarded plywood over to the broken windows, wedging them tightly against the frames to block the howling wind. It plunged the shed into near darkness, but it cut the draft in half. I cleared a space in the center of the wooden floor, sweeping away glass and dirt with my shoe. I laid down the canvas duffel bag as a mattress and wrapped Colleen in the fleece blanket. "Stay in the blanket. Don't come out," I ordered. I spent the next hour scavenging the immediate area outside before the sun completely vanished. I found a rusted metal barrel, some dryish cardboard boxes from a nearby abandoned warehouse, and a few broken branches. I dragged them all inside. Using my pocket knife, I shaved the dry inner wood from the branches, piled it on top of torn cardboard inside the barrel, and used the flint striker on my keychain to spark a fire. When the flames finally caught, casting a warm, flickering orange glow against the rusted tin walls, Colleen let out a small cheer. The smoke drafted upwards, miraculously escaping through a rusted hole in the high ceiling rather than suffocating us. We sat huddled around the burning barrel, sharing a half-crushed sleeve of saltine crackers I had found at the bottom of the duffel bag. It was our grand banquet. "Liam?" Colleen asked softly, staring into the fire. "Yeah. Bug? Do you think Mom and Dad know we bought a house?" I pulled her closer, resting my chin on her head. "I think they're the ones who saved that $5 bill for us." That first night was a brutal test of endurance. I didn't sleep for a single second. I spent the entire night feeding the fire with whatever scraps of cardboard and debris I could find, watching Colleen's chest rise and fall to make sure she was still breathing. The metal walls groaned and popped as the temperature outside dropped into the teens. Every time the wind hit the shed, it sounded like a freight train was passing right through us. But as the weak, gray morning light finally filtered through the cracks in the walls, we were still alive. We had survived our first night in the rusted house. But I knew, looking at my depleted pile of scavenged wood, that we wouldn't survive a second night unless I found real fuel and real food. By the fourth day, the great frost hit Oakhaven. The local radio station, playing faintly from a battery-operated radio I'd salvaged from the trash, reported that temperatures were breaking century-old records. The entire town was buried under 2 feet of snow, and the power grid was failing in the residential districts. Inside the rusted shed, the situation had gone from desperate to critical. I had spent the daylight hours trudging through knee-deep snow, begging for work at the grocery store, the gas station, even knocking on doors, offering to shovel driveways. But nobody had money to spare, and most doors were slammed in my face before I could even finish my sentence. I managed to trade my winter gloves to a gas station attendant for a loaf of stale bread and a jar of cheap peanut butter. When I returned to the shed, my bare hands were cracked and bleeding, but my heart stopped entirely when I heard the sound coming from inside. It was a wet, rattling cough. I threw open the metal door. Colleen was curled into a tight ball on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Her skin was pale, but her cheeks were flushed with an unnatural, burning red heat. I dropped the bread and rushed to her, pulling off my freezing jacket and wrapping it around her already blanketed form. "Colleen? Hey, look at me," I pleaded, touching her forehead. It was burning up. She had a terrible fever. "I'm cold, Liam," she whispered weakly, her eyes barely opening. "It hurts to breathe." Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through my chest. If she got pneumonia out here, she would die. I had no money for a doctor, no car to get to a hospital, and if I called an ambulance, Mrs. Higgins would be there in an hour to take her away. I had to get the shed warm. I had to get it hot. But my scavenged wood pile was completely gone. I had burned every piece of cardboard, every dry weed, every scrap of garbage in the vicinity. There was nothing left. I looked around the barren, rusted room with wild, desperate eyes. My gaze landed on the floor, the thick, uneven wooden planks. They were old, heavy timber. If I could pry them up, they would burn for hours. They were the only fuel source left. I ran to the corner where the pile of discarded junk sat and dug frantically until I found a heavy, rusted iron crowbar. I moved to the far corner of the shed, away from where Colleen was sleeping, and drove the wedged end of the crowbar into the seam between two massive floorboards. I pushed down with all my weight. The ancient wood groaned, resisting, then snapped with a loud crack, splintering upward. I tore the heavy plank away with my bare hands, tossing it toward the burn barrel. I jammed the crowbar into the next board, fueled by pure adrenaline and the sound of my sister's ragged breathing. Crack. Another board came up. I drove the crowbar down for a third time, aiming for the joist underneath. Instead of the dull thud of wood hitting dirt, the heavy iron crowbar struck something else. Clang. The sound was sharp, metallic, and incredibly loud. It vibrated up the shaft of the crowbar, stinging my palms, and echoed around the tin walls of the shed. I froze. It wasn't a pipe. The sound was too deep, too resonant. It sounded hollow. Frowning, I dropped to my knees and used my bleeding hands to scrape away decades of accumulated dirt, dead spiders, and wood rot from the exposed space beneath the floorboards. My fingers brushed against something freezing cold and perfectly smooth. I grabbed my dying flashlight and clicked it on, shining the weak yellow beam into the hole. Buried directly beneath the dirt, flush with the concrete foundation of the shed, was a massive plate of dark, brushed steel. I frantically pried up 3 more floorboards, exposing an area about 4 feet wide. It wasn't just a plate, it was a door, a heavy, industrial steel hatch, exactly like the ones you'd see on a submarine or a bank vault. In the center of the hatch was a large, circular, rotary wheel with thick locking bars extending into the concrete. Stenciled onto the steel in faded, military-style white paint were the numbers 04B. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked back at Colleen, who had fallen into a feverish, restless sleep, then back to the hatch. Who puts a vault door under a rusted canning shed? My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it a septic tank? A storm cellar? No, the engineering was too advanced, too heavy-duty. I wiped the sweat and grime from my face, gripped the cold steel of the rotary wheel with both hands, and pulled. It didn't budge. It was locked tight, rusted shut by time and neglect. "Come on," I gritted through my teeth, planting my boots on the edges of the steel frame for leverage. I threw every ounce of my body weight backward, straining until black spots danced in my vision. "Move, damn it!" Nothing. I grabbed the iron crowbar, slid it through the spokes of the rotary wheel to create a lever, and pushed with all my might. The metal shrieked. A terrifying screech of breaking rust echoed through the shed. Suddenly, the wheel gave way with a heavy, mechanical thunk. A sudden hiss filled the air, the sound of a pressurized seal breaking, releasing a rush of stale, incredibly dry, and strangely warm air from the darkness below. I dropped the crowbar, grabbed the handle of the hatch, and pulled upward. It was perfectly counterweighted on massive internal hinges, rising smoothly despite its incredible weight. I shone my flickering flashlight down into the abyss. A set of pristine aluminum stairs led down into darkness, but the beam of my light caught something at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't a dirt floor. It was polished gray linoleum tile, and the walls weren't concrete. They were painted a clean, clinical white. I grabbed a piece of the broken floorboard, lit the end of it in the burn barrel to create a makeshift torch, and carefully descended the stairs. 10 steps down, 20 steps. The air grew noticeably warmer with every step, completely insulated from the freezing blizzard above. When I reached the bottom, I held the torch high. The light flooded the underground space, and my jaw dropped. It was a massive, reinforced bunker, at least 5 times the size of the rusted shed above. But it wasn't just an empty concrete box. Row upon row of heavy-duty metal shelving stretched across the room. The shelves were packed tightly with hundreds of military-grade MREs, meals ready to eat, massive plastic drums of purified water, medical kits, and heavy wool blankets sealed in vacuum bags. In the corner sat a massive, diesel-powered generator hooked up to an intricate air filtration system, and next to the generator was a fully stocked, pristine, potbelly wood stove, with cords of dry, split firewood stacked neatly against the wall. It was a Cold War-era fallout shelter, immaculately preserved, completely forgotten by the town above. I had just found a fully stocked, heated fortress. We were saved. Colleen wasn't going to freeze. We had food for months. I let out a breathless, half-crazy laugh, falling to my knees in the center of the bunker. "Thank you," I whispered to whoever had built this, to my parents, to the universe. But as the light from my torch flickered across the back wall of the bunker, my relief was suddenly cut short. At the far end of the room, separated from the survival supplies, was a heavy oak desk. Sitting in the center of the desk was an old, black leather briefcase, securely locked, and piled around the briefcase, hastily dumped, as if someone had been in a desperate hurry, were stacks of documents. I stood up and walked slowly toward the desk. I picked up the top document. It was a land survey of Oakhaven, stamped with the official seal of the mayor's office, but heavy, red marker lines were drawn all over it, circling properties including the very lot my shed sat on. Underneath the map was a ledger. I opened it. There were names, dozens of names of Oakhaven citizens. Next to each name were staggering amounts of money and dates stretching back 30 years. And right there, halfway down the page, written in bold black ink, was a name that made the blood freeze in my veins. Thomas Gallagher, my father. Next to his name was a sum of $2 million, and the word liquidated. My hands began to shake. This wasn't just a survival bunker. It was a hiding place. And whoever had built it, whoever had hidden these documents, knew exactly why my parents' car had been run off the road 8 months ago. I stared at the locked black briefcase. The $5 house hadn't just saved our lives. It had just plunged us into the middle of a war. The revelation paralyzed me for a fraction of a second, but the sound of Colleen's ragged coughing from the freezing shed above snapped me back to reality. The conspiracy could wait. My sister's life could not. I bolted up the aluminum stairs, the abrupt transition from the bunker's dry warmth to the shed's biting, sub-zero draft, hitting me like a physical punch. I dropped to my knees beside Colleen. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were clicking together, her skin pale and waxy in the dim light of the dying burn barrel. "I've got you, Bug. I've got you," I murmured, scooping her up into my arms. She felt terrifyingly light. I grabbed our canvas duffel bag and carefully navigated the narrow, exposed opening in the floorboards. As we descended into the bunker, the heavy, insulated warmth enveloped us. I laid Colleen down on one of the pristine wool blankets stacked on the bottom shelf, wrapping her tightly like a cocoon. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins. I went straight to work. The bunker was a masterpiece of survivalist engineering. The potbelly stove was already primed with dry kindling and a stack of split oak. I struck a match, and within minutes, a roaring fire cast a brilliant, comforting golden glow across the white walls. The heavy steel hatch above us muffled the howling blizzard completely. Down here, it was silent, safe, and incredibly warm. Next, I raided the medical supplies. Whoever built this place was prepared for the apocalypse. I found a sealed first aid trauma kit containing a bottle of liquid children's ibuprofen. The expiration date was a few years old, but I knew it would still work. I poured a dose and gently tilted Colleen's head back, coaxing her to swallow the sweet, cherry-flavored syrup. Then came the food. I grabbed a military MRE, labeled beef stew, cracked the chemical heating pouch, and poured purified water from a massive blue drum to activate it. Within 10 minutes, the rich, savory smell of hot meat and potatoes filled the bunker. It was the best thing I had ever smelled in my entire life. I fed Colleen slowly, spoonful by spoonful. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the bright, warm environment. She looked at the towering shelves of food, the roaring fire, and then at me. "Is this heaven, Liam?" she whispered, her voice weak but steady. Tears spilled over my eyelids, cutting tracks through the soot and dirt on my face. "No, Bug. It's better. It's home." Once her stomach was full and the medicine took effect, the terrifying flush of her fever began to recede. Her breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful, healing sleep. For the first time in 8 months, I didn't have to watch the door. I didn't have to worry about the cold. With Colleen safe, my attention was magnetically drawn back to the heavy oak desk at the far end of the bunker. The black leather briefcase sat there, silently mocking me. I grabbed the heavy iron crowbar I had brought down from the shed. The briefcase was secured with 2 solid brass combination locks. I didn't have the time or the patience for combinations. I wedged the flattened tip of the crowbar under the right latch and drove the heel of my palm against the iron shaft. The brass shattered with a loud crack. I repeated the process on the left latch, tearing the leather as the lock gave way. I flipped the lid open. Inside were neat, meticulously organized stacks of manila folders, a series of encrypted USB flash drives, and a thick, leather-bound journal. I opened the journal first. The handwriting was sharp, erratic, and deeply paranoid. The name inscribed on the inside cover was Benjamin Hayes. The name hit me like a freight train. Benjamin Hayes was Oak Haven's former city treasurer. 2 years ago, he had vanished without a trace, leaving his wife, his car, and his entire life behind. The local police had ruled it a suicide, claiming he had jumped off the Hawthorne Bridge into the freezing river below, though his body was never recovered. I began to read, and with every page I turned, the sick, twisting knot in my stomach pulled tighter. Hayes hadn't killed himself. He had gone into hiding. He had built this bunker in secret, terrified for his life, because he had uncovered a massive, systemic criminal enterprise operating out of the mayor's office. According to the journal, Mayor Richard Sterling wasn't trying to save our dying logging town. He was actively killing it. Sterling had struck a massive, under-the-table deal with a multinational tech conglomerate. The conglomerate wanted Oak Haven's land, specifically the industrial sector and the riverfront, to build a massive billion-dollar data center. But they didn't want to pay fair market value to the dozens of local business owners and residents who held the deeds. So, Mayor Sterling enacted the Oak Haven Revitalization Project. He weaponized the city's building codes and tax assessments. He artificially inflated property taxes for targeted citizens, then dispatched corrupt city inspectors to hit them with crippling fines for minor, fabricated structural violations. When the business owners inevitably went bankrupt, the city would condemn the properties, seize them, and sell them at dummy auctions just like the one I had attended to shell companies owned by the mayor's associates. I flipped to the manila folders. They contained the hard evidence, bank wire transfers, fake inspection reports, and emails printed out in stark black and white. But it was the final folder, labeled Gallagher Hardware, that made my blood run cold. My father, Thomas Gallagher, wasn't a fool. He was a pillar of the community, and he had noticed the pattern. When the city inspectors came for our family hardware store, my father fought back. He hired private investigators. He started asking the right questions to the wrong people. He was building a coalition of local business owners to file a massive class action lawsuit against the city. My dad was going to blow the whistle. I pulled out a printed email exchange dated exactly 8 months ago. It was between Mayor Sterling and an email address I recognized instantly. A Gallagher_investments@oakhaven.net. Uncle Arthur. Arthur, the email read, your brother is becoming an existential threat to the timeline of the data center acquisition. The buyers are getting cold feet. If Thomas files that injunction tomorrow, the deal collapses. You assured me you could control your family. Fix this, or you lose your 15% equity stake in the shell company. Arthur's reply was short, brutal, and utterly damning. Consider it handled. Thomas won't be at the courthouse tomorrow. Just make sure you uphold your end of the bargain regarding my legal guardianship of the kids. I need control of the estate to liquidate the hardware store quietly. The journal dropped from my trembling hands, hitting the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. It wasn't black ice. It wasn't a blown tire. My parents didn't die in a tragic accident on Highway 9. Uncle Arthur had murdered his own brother for a payout, orchestrated the seizure of our family's legacy, and systematically tortured his own niece and nephew to cover his tracks. The rusted, condemned shed I had bought for $5 wasn't just a discarded piece of property. It was Benjamin Hayes's land. Hayes had deliberately let it go into tax default to keep it off the radar, hiding his bunker beneath a structure so toxic and worthless that no shell company would ever bother to investigate it. I had bought the physical grave of the mayor's entire empire. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a rusted folding chair next to Colleen's makeshift bed, staring into the flickering embers of the potbelly stove, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. The evidence in the briefcase was enough to put Mayor Sterling, Uncle Arthur, and half the city council in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. But having the evidence and surviving long enough to deliver it were two entirely different things. I couldn't go to the Oakhaven police. Hayes's journal made it explicitly clear that the local chief of police was on Sterling's payroll. I needed to get to Portland. I needed the FBI. I glanced at my watch. It was 7 a.m. on a Sunday. The blizzard raging above had likely buried the town in 3 feet of snow, meaning the roads out of Oakhaven were impassable. We were trapped in the bunker for at least another 24 hours until the county plows could clear the highways. I packed the manila folders, the encrypted USB drives, and Hayes's journal tightly into my canvas duffel bag, wrapping them in a spare wool shirt to protect them from moisture. I secured the heavy brass zipper. Whenever the storm broke, we would leave everything else behind and walk straight to the state highway to hitch a ride. Liam? I turned. Colleen was sitting up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. The terrifying pallor was entirely gone from her face, replaced by a healthy, rosy warmth. Hey, Bug, how are you feeling? I asked, kneeling beside her. Hungry, she said, giving me a small, genuine smile. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I grabbed a tin of preserved peaches from the shelf, popped the lid, and handed her a plastic spoon. Breakfast of champions. Eat up. While she ate, I began strategizing. If we stayed down here, we were completely off the grid. No one knew this bunker existed except Benjamin Hayes, and he was long gone. Uncle Arthur believed we were freezing to death in a tin shed. We had the element of absolute surprise. Thud. The sound was heavy, muffled, and distinctly out of place. It didn't come from the wind, and it didn't come from the bunker. It came from the rusted shed directly above our heads. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I held a finger up to my lips, signaling Colleen to be completely silent. Her eyes widened in fear, the spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. Screech. The horrifying, unmistakable sound of the shed's heavy metal front door grinding open against the concrete foundation echoed down the ventilation shaft. The howling roar of the blizzard briefly filtered down, followed immediately by the heavy slam of the door shutting again. Someone was inside our house. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched across the frozen wooden floorboards above. The floor of the shed creaked and groaned under the weight. Crunch, step, crunch, step. The footsteps stopped exactly where I had torn up the floorboards. "Liam?" The voice filtered down through the open hatch above. It was muffled, but the gravelly, menacing tone was impossible to mistake. It was Uncle Arthur. Panic seized my throat. How did he know? Why was he here? Then I remembered the auction. He had been sitting in the second row, laughing with the mayor. He had watched me buy parcel number 889. He knew exactly where I had taken Colleen. He probably assumed the blizzard had finished the job he started, and he had come to the shed to confirm his gruesome victory, to ensure his loose ends were finally tied up. Well, Arthur's voice boomed, echoing slightly down the concrete shaft. What do we have here? He had found the open hatch. In my desperate rush to get Colleen into the warmth, I hadn't even attempted to close the massive steel door behind us. It was standing wide open, an undeniable invitation leading straight down into the earth. "Colleen, listen to me very carefully," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. I pointed to the darkest, deepest corner of the bunker, behind a towering rack of massive blue water drums. "Take your blanket, go hide behind those barrels. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. She slipped out of bed, grabbed the heavy wool blanket, and darted silently into the shadows behind the water drums, disappearing completely from view. I frantically scanned the room for a weapon. My pocket knife was pathetic. The iron crowbar I had used to break the briefcase was lying on the desk at the far end of the room, too far away. I grabbed a heavy, cast-iron fire poker from the stand next to the potbelly stove. It was 2 feet long, ending in a vicious, soot-stained hook. I stepped back, pressing my spine against the wall right beside the bottom of the aluminum staircase, hiding in the blind spot. A bright beam of light sliced through the darkness above, sweeping down the staircase. "Liam?" Arthur called out again. His tone had shifted. The arrogant cruelty was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. "I know you're down there, boy. I can see the firelight." He began to descend. Clank, clank, clank. His heavy boots hit the aluminum treads slowly, cautiously. As he came further down the stairs, the firelight caught the object gripped tightly in his right hand. It was a heavy, snub-nosed revolver. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought it might crack my sternum. He hadn't just come to check if we had frozen. He had come to make sure we were dead. Arthur stepped off the final stair onto the linoleum floor. He swept the beam of his heavy maglite across the bunker, illuminating the towering shelves of food, the generator, and finally, the heavy oak desk at the back of the room. His eyes locked onto the smashed black briefcase. He let out a low, ragged breath. "Hayes," he muttered to himself, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You son of a bitch, you hid it here." Arthur took 2 steps toward the desk, entirely focused on the documents scattered across the wood, completely oblivious to me standing flat against the wall, just inches behind him. It was now or never. I tightened my grip on the cast-iron poker, stepped out from the shadows, and swung with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. I didn't aim for his head. I aimed for the hand holding the weapon. The heavy, cast-iron fire poker whistled through the stale air of the bunker. It connected with Arthur's thick wrist with a sickening, wet crack. Arthur roared in agony, a sound like a wounded animal, and the snub-nosed revolver clattered onto the linoleum floor, sliding away into the shadows beneath the aluminum stairs. The heavy maglite dropped from his other hand, rolling wildly across the floor and casting erratic, strobe-like beams of light against the white walls. Before he could recover from the shock, I dropped the poker and tackled him around the waist, using the momentum of my swing to drive all of my weight into his midsection. For a scrawny, underfed 18-year-old, the adrenaline gave me the strength of a freight train. We both went crashing to the floor, slamming hard against the base of the massive blue water drums. "You little bastard," Arthur spat, blood and spittle flying from his lips. He was decades older, but he had the thick, heavy build of a man who had spent his youth working lumber mills before trading his flannel for expensive suits. He shoved me off him with terrifying ease, sending me skidding across the slick linoleum. My shoulder slammed into the metal legs of a shelving unit, sending a dozen heavy cans of military rations crashing down around me. I scrambled to my hands and knees, gasping for breath, my eyes frantically searching the erratic beams of the spinning flashlight for the gun. It was gone, lost in the chaotic shadows. Arthur staggered to his feet, clutching his shattered wrist against his chest. His face, illuminated in the flickering golden glow of the potbelly stove, was twisted into a mask of absolute murderous rage. He kicked the rolling flashlight away, plunging that half of the bunker into dim firelight. "You think you're smart, Liam?" Arthur sneered, taking a heavy, deliberate step toward me. He reached into his coat with his good hand and pulled out a long, serrated hunting knife. The polished steel caught the firelight. "You think finding Hayes's little rat hole changes anything? You think a jury is going to believe a homeless dropout over the legal guardian who tragically lost his niece and nephew to a freak blizzard? You killed them?" I rasped, pushing myself up against the shelving unit, my hands desperately grasping for anything I could use as a weapon. "You killed your own brother." "Thomas was a fool," Arthur growled, advancing slowly, cornering me between the shelves and the desk. He couldn't see the big picture. He wanted to play the noble hero, protecting this rotting, dead-end town. "Oak Haven is a corpse, Liam. Sterling and I were just selling the organs. $2 million. Liam, that was my cut. Do you have any idea what kind of life that buys?" "It buys a jail cell," I spat back. Arthur laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Who's going to put me there? You? You're going to freeze to death down here, boy, and when the spring thaw comes, the city's going to bulldoze that rusted piece of garbage above us right into the foundation. No one will ever know you were here." He lunged. I threw myself to the side as the heavy serrated blade sparked against the metal shelving unit where my head had been a fraction of a second earlier. I grabbed a heavy, unopened MRE package from the floor and hurled it at his face. It hit him square in the nose, stunning him just long enough for me to dive toward the desk. I snatched the heavy iron crowbar I had used to break the briefcase. It was much heavier than the fire poker, awkward and unbalanced, but it was all I had. Arthur wiped a smear of blood from his nose and smiled, a terrible, cold smile. "Come on, then. Be a man, like your father." He slashed horizontally, the knife cutting through the thick canvas of my jacket and grazing my ribs. A sharp, burning pain flared across my side. I swung the crowbar in a wide, desperate arc, aiming for his knees, but he stepped back, letting the heavy iron whistle harmlessly past him. The momentum threw me off balance. Arthur drove his heavy boot into my stomach. The air exploded from my lungs, and I collapsed onto my back, the crowbar slipping from my numb fingers. I lay there, completely defenseless, staring up at the barrel-chested monster who had destroyed my family. He stood over me, raising the hunting knife high above his head, ready to drive it down into my chest. "Say hi to Thomas for me," Arthur whispered. Clang. The sound was deafening. Arthur froze, his eyes going wide with shock. He let out a low, breathless gasp, the knife slipping from his fingers to clatter harmlessly beside my head. He swayed on his feet, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed forward like a felled oak tree, hitting the linoleum with a massive, echoing thud. Standing behind him, clutching a massive, dented tin can of preserved peaches in both of her small hands, was Colleen. She was trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face, but she had stepped out from the shadows of the water drums and swung the heavy can directly into the back of Arthur's skull with everything she had. "I told you not to come out, Bug," I wheezed, pushing Arthur's dead weight off my legs. Colleen dropped the can and threw her arms around my neck, sobbing violently into my chest. "He was going to hurt you, Liam. He was going to hurt you." I know, I whispered, pulling her tight against me, ignoring the burning pain in my side. "You did so good, Colleen. You saved us. You saved me." I didn't waste another second. I rolled Arthur over. He was out cold, a steady stream of blood pooling beneath his head, but his chest was rising and falling. He was alive. I ran to the medical supply shelves and grabbed a fistful of heavy-duty industrial zip ties used for securing emergency splints. I dragged Arthur's limp body to the structural support beam of the aluminum staircase. I wrapped his arms around the thick metal pillar and pulled the thick plastic ties as tight as they would go around his wrists, locking him to the beam. I did the same to his ankles. Then, I meticulously searched his pockets. I found his car keys, his wallet, and his cell phone. I took them all. I found the revolver beneath the stairs, emptied the bullets into my pocket, and tossed the gun into the burn barrel of the potbelly stove. We had the evidence. We had the confession. And now, we had the monster himself. The blizzard raged for another 36 hours. During that time, Arthur regained consciousness. At first, he screamed, threatened, and thrashed against the zip ties, turning his wrists bloody in a futile attempt to escape. When he realized the thick plastic wasn't going to break, he turned to begging. He offered me the $2 million. He offered me the hardware store. He promised to leave the country and never return. I sat at Hayes' heavy oak desk, silently cataloging the evidence into my canvas duffel bag, entirely ignoring his pathetic pleas. I made sure Colleen stayed on the far side of the bunker, headphones from the survival radio over her ears, listening to static, just so she wouldn't have to hear his voice. On the morning of the third day, the howling wind above finally stopped. I climbed the aluminum stairs and pushed the heavy steel hatch open. The rusted tin shed was freezing, completely buried in snow, but the broken windows let in a blinding, brilliant shaft of pure winter sunlight. The storm was over. I went back down and helped Colleen into her thickest clothes, wrapping the bunker's heavy wool blanket around her shoulders like a cape. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder, the weight of the ledgers, the USB drives, and Hayes' journal pressing heavily against my back. "Where are we going, Liam?" Colleen asked, holding my hand tightly. "We're going to finish this," I said. I walked over to the support beam where Arthur sat slumped in defeat. I set 3 unopened MREs and a gallon jug of purified water on the floor, just within his reach. "You're not going to freeze, Arthur, and you're not going to starve," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "You're going to sit right here in the dark and think about my father until the federal marshals come to cut you down." I turned my back on him, took Colleen's hand, and we walked up the stairs, out of the bunker, and into the freezing, blinding white light of Oak Haven. The walk to the state highway was brutal, trudging through waist-deep snowdrifts, but the sky was clear and the sun was warm. When we finally reached Highway 9, it had already been plowed. We didn't have to wait long. A long-haul trucker heading north to Portland saw us shivering on the shoulder and pulled his massive rig over. 4 hours later, we walked through the glass doors of the FBI field office in downtown Portland. When I dumped the contents of the black briefcase onto the intake agent's desk, followed by Mayor Sterling's emails and Hayes' ledger, the room went dead silent. The agent took one look at the documents, picked up his phone, and called the special agent in charge. The fallout was biblical. Within 48 hours, a convoy of black SUVs descended upon Oak Haven. They didn't bother with the local corrupt police. The feds raided City Hall, dragging Mayor Sterling out in handcuffs in front of local news cameras. They raided the dummy shell companies, freezing hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts. And heavily armed tactical units breached the rusted, condemned shed at the end of Briarwood Lane. They cut the locks on the hatch, descended into the bunker, and arrested Arthur Gallagher exactly where I had left him. The investigation blew the lid off the largest municipal corruption scandal in Oregon's history. The tech conglomerate, terrified of the catastrophic PR nightmare, immediately backed out of the data center deal, returning all seized properties to their rightful owners. Because I had secured the legal deed to parcel 889 at the county auction, the bunker, the land, and everything inside it belonged entirely to me. The state reimbursed us for the fraudulent liquidation of our father's hardware store, returning the business, the building, and our family home to our names with interest. Mrs. Higgins, the CPS worker, mysteriously retired early when her name turned up on a list of minor city officials who had received bonuses from the mayor's office to look the other way when orphaned children were displaced. Uncle Arthur and Mayor Sterling were indicted on 34 counts of racketeering, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. They both received federal life sentences without the possibility of parole. 6 months later, spring had fully returned to Oakhaven. The snow was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant, blooming green of the Pacific Northwest. I stood on the edge of the freshly paved driveway on Briarwood Lane, holding Colleen's hand. The rusted, corrugated tin shed was completely gone, torn down and hauled away by a professional demolition crew. In its place stood the solid concrete foundation of a brand new house. We were building directly over the bunker, which we had converted into a permanent, state-of-the-art storm cellar. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small glass picture frame. Inside it, perfectly pressed and preserved, was a crumpled, dirt-stained $5 bill. It was the absolute lowest point of my life, the moment I thought I had failed my sister completely. But looking at it now, I realized it wasn't a symbol of our poverty, it was the key to our salvation. We had bought a rusted coffin, and instead, we found the strength to bury the monsters who put us there.